The 18th of June 1940, Charles de Gaulle, aged 49, is at a BBC microphone in London, his uniform yet sharp despite 2 days of hurried travel and nearly no rest. His voice, low and measured, travels over the channel to a France that has just consented to cease combat. France has lost a battle, he states, every word selected with the accuracy of one who grasps he is addressing history, but France has not lost the war. The line will resonate for decades, etched onto monuments, cited in textbooks, presented as the instant French resistance began. What those textbooks seldom note is the British Prime Minister in his office at 10 Downing Street, puffing a cigar, hearing reports of the broadcast he had approved just hours before, and weighing if this tall, problematic French general would be a benefit or a terrible burden. Winston Churchill, age 65, had encountered de Gaulle precisely twice prior to letting him address France on British radio. The initial meeting had endured maybe 20 minutes, the next one somewhat more. In those short exchanges, Churchill had assessed the French general with the skilled eye of someone who had passed 5 decades in politics, and what he observed made him hesitate even as he granted his consent. De Gaulle was arrogant, formal, completely certain of his own rightness, and stood for almost nothing regarding real military strength. He had reached London with one assistant and anything he could bring. No soldiers, no land, no government support, no funds, just total conviction that he, Charles de Gaulle, personified France. He believes he's Joan of Arc, Churchill murmurs to an assistant that evening, though if this is grievance or remark stays uncertain. What is certain is that Churchill has chosen to bet on this problematic man, not because he fancies him, but because Britain urgently requires someone, anyone, to maintain the notion of French resistance. The account of what Churchill truly said regarding de Gaulle's well-known declaration is not one remark, but a development, a connection that starts with practical consideration and grows into something much more complex. To grasp it, one must return 3 days to the instant when all France had constructed fell apart in mere hours. The 17th of June 1940, Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister, steps down instead of conceding defeat. Philippe Pétain, aged 84, a hero of the last war, assumes his position and straightaway asks for a truce with Germany. In London, Churchill gets the update with the stark awareness that his deepest fears have become real. France, Britain's main ally, the country that was meant to stand firm while Britain gathered forces, is yielding after 6 weeks of combat, yet there is one French general who declines to accept this. Charles de Gaulle, who had been acting as Reynaud's Undersecretary of State for War, had winged to London the prior day on a British aircraft organized by Churchill's government. The British Prime Minister had seen him shortly during previous visits to France, had observed his forceful support for armored combat, his disdain for the protective mindset that had condemned French strategy. Now de Gaulle reaches Churchill's office with a proposition that verges on boldness. He desires to address France on British radio to inform the French populace that their government is mistaken, that the battle must go on, that he, a fairly low-ranking general with no formal power, embodies the real spirit of France. Churchill's counselors indicate the clear issues. De Gaulle has no lawful right to talk for France. Pétain is the lawful leader of the French government. Airing de Gaulle's communication might be viewed as meddling in French domestic matters, could harm Britain's connection with whichever French government arises from the truce talks. De Gaulle is requesting Britain to basically back an uprising against France's lawful authorities. Churchill hears these disagreements, weighs them for maybe 30 seconds, and then sanctions the broadcast regardless. His logic is harshly pragmatic. Britain currently stands isolated against Germany. The French fleet, the 4th biggest navy in the world, rests in ports across the Mediterranean and North Africa. French colonial lands cover the globe. French troops, hundreds of thousands of them, are dispersed across France and the Empire. If all of these resources just yield to whichever government Hitler permits Pétain to form, Britain's strategic situation becomes almost desperate. Churchill requires a Frenchman who will continue fighting, even if that Frenchman is problematic, arrogant, and controls nothing save his own belief. De Gaulle is not Churchill's initial pick, not even his second or third, but he is the option that has appeared, waiting in Churchill's office with the sort of conviction that cannot be argued with or diverted. Very well, Churchill states, and the BBC is directed to give de Gaulle airtime the next evening. What Churchill says to de Gaulle in that instant of approval is not documented in detail, but observers recall the Prime Minister's style as heartening, without being friendly, helpful, without being gushing. Churchill regards de Gaulle as a handy tool, not as a collaborator or peer. He clarifies that Britain will back free French attempts, but the tone implies a sponsor bestowing kindness on a petitioner, not a chief recognizing another chief. De Gaulle, for his side, receives the backing with the manner of one who thinks he is doing Britain a kindness by permitting them to assist France. The conflict of these two huge egos is instant and clear to all in the room. The following evening, de Gaulle gives his address. The real words are more subtle than the well-known quote implies. He talks for 5 minutes, urging French soldiers, engineers, laborers to unite with him in London. He asserts that France has been beaten by machine power, not by absence of bravery, and that greater machine power will ultimately beat Germany. He casts the war not as a French struggle, but as a worldwide one, where France's part will be decided not by Petain's submission, but by those who persist in fighting. The address is articulate, rebellious, and heard by nearly no one. This is the point that history frequently ignores. In June 1940, very few individuals in France possessed shortwave radios able to pick up BBC broadcasts plainly. The French government, even before the truce, had deterred listening to foreign radio. Most French nationals are unaware that some general they have never known of has talked from London. The address's effect is not instant but collective, as the BBC replays sections over the subsequent days and weeks, as copies are produced and circulated, as news travels gradually through occupied and unoccupied France. Churchill, seeing reports on the broadcast's reception, grasps this straight away. De Gaulle's address is not a battle call that at once musters resistance. It is a seed placed in unsure ground, and if it flourishes, relies on what occurs next. What Churchill says regarding the address in the days just after is practical and restrained. To his war cabinet, he portrays de Gaulle as a handy emblem, a voice that can be magnified to advance British strategic goals. He does not yet talk of de Gaulle with the irritation that will define his future remarks. That will arrive as he finds out just how difficult de Gaulle is to manage. The initial true challenge arrives in 2 weeks. Churchill must immobilize the French fleet to stop it from dropping into German hands. The biggest gathering of French battleships rests at Mers el-Khabir in Algeria. Churchill commands the Royal Navy to give the French admiral a final demand. Join the British, travel to British ports and be held, travel to French Caribbean ports and be disarmed or be annihilated. The French admiral rejects all choices. On the 3rd of July 1940, British vessels start shooting at their past allies. Almost 1,300 French seamen perish in the assault. De Gaulle is appalled. He grasps the strategic need but observes the political disaster. How can he muster French forces to Britain when Britain has just slain French seamen? He objects to Churchill, requires clarifications, asserts that this makes his task almost impossible. Churchill's reply is direct and exposes the basic dynamic that will shape their connection. Britain, he clarifies, is battling for its existence. France opted to capitulate. The French fleet embodied a danger that Britain could not disregard. De Gaulle's task, however vital to de Gaulle, is subordinate to British existence. If de Gaulle finds this intolerable, he is free to go back to France and accept Petain's truce. De Gaulle does not go back to France. He stifles his fury, releases a declaration recognizing the disaster while preserving his backing for Britain, and carries on his work. But the event defines the template. Churchill will back de Gaulle when it helps British goals and overrule him when it does not. De Gaulle will tolerate this setup because he has no other choice, but he will never pardon the lesser position, it suggests. Over the subsequent months, as de Gaulle gradually grows the Free French forces, Churchill's remarks about him start to change. The initial practical evaluation yields to increasing irritation. De Gaulle shows himself difficult to control. He declines to be handled as a British pawn. He demands to be conferred with on operations concerning French forces. He requires acknowledgement not as a handy outcast but as the lawful delegate of France. He disputes British choices, quarrels in gatherings, dispatches long memos detailing why British policy toward France is myopic. Churchill's team starts to fear meetings with de Gaulle. The French general is joyless, stiff, and completely opposed to yielding on issues of French sovereignty and dignity. He regards every dispute as a point of principle. He never jests, never relents, never admits that his stance could be even somewhat irrational. By early 1941, Churchill's personal remarks about de Gaulle have assumed a clearly annoyed tone. He believes he is the rebirth of Joan of Arc, Churchill informs assistants, the analogy no longer vague. He intends it as censure. De Gaulle's prophetic conviction, his total incapacity to view himself as anything but the personification of France, makes him exceptionally hard to partner with. But Churchill also perceives something different, something he concedes reluctantly in his more thoughtful times. De Gaulle's difficult arrogance, his rejection of a lesser role, his assertion of French dignity even when France has been beaten and occupied, these identical traits make him successful. Other French outcasts in London are prepared to be lesser partners to Britain. They receive British guidance, yield to British choices, admit the fact of France's frailty. De Gaulle only behaves as if France is yet a major power, as if British backing is a kindness instead of a need, as if the truce was a brief obstacle instead of a national disaster. This stance enrages Churchill and all who interact with de Gaulle. It also makes de Gaulle the sole French chief who can plausibly assert to embody French sovereignty instead of French submission. The very traits that make him difficult to control make him difficult to disregard. The intricacy of Churchill's opinion becomes plain in his deeds. He grumbles about de Gaulle endlessly. He labels him problematic, irrational, difficult. He jests grimly about the load of interacting with him, but he also shields him. When other British figures propose substituting de Gaulle with more flexible French persons, Churchill declines. When de Gaulle's stance seems endangered by competitors inside the Free French movement, Churchill steps in to back him. When American figures, especially President Roosevelt, voice their strong aversion to de Gaulle and press for different French chiefs, Churchill supports him. He is the sole one who counts, Churchill informs Roosevelt in 1942, when the American president proposes cooperating with other French chiefs. The rest are all sycophants. De Gaulle is difficult, but he is the sole one who embodies anything genuine. This is maybe the nearest Churchill gets to voicing what he truly believes about de Gaulle's well-known declaration that France has lost a battle, but not the war. He never straight out remarks on the address itself in his memoirs or taped talks. He does not repeat it back to de Gaulle or cite it in their gatherings, but his deeds imply he perceives its importance even as he finds its creator unbearable. The address was bold, asserting power that did not exist, declaring that one general could talk for a beaten nation, maintaining that France's real nature was shaped not by its government's submission, but by one man's rejection to accept it. This boldness is precisely what makes de Gaulle precious and precisely what makes him difficult. By 1943, Churchill's well-known remark about the Cross of Lorraine clarifies his sentiments. The weightiest cross I have to carry, he states, is the Cross of Lorraine. The Free French emblem becomes a symbol for de Gaulle himself, a load Churchill transports because he has to, not because he desires to. But even this grievance holds a sort of regard. Churchill does not state de Gaulle is useless or ought to be forsaken. He states de Gaulle is weighty, hard to carry. The suggestion is that the load is essential, that Churchill will keep transporting it because the other option, a France with no voice of opposition at all, is inferior. Their connection hits its bottom point during the preparations for D-Day. De Gaulle is maintained mostly unaware about Operation Overlord until just prior to its start. Churchill and the Allied command do not entrust him with the particulars, afraid he will spill information or try to meddle. When de Gaulle at last finds out the scale of the operation, he is enraged at being omitted from planning that will decide France's future. Churchill's reply is typical. He admits de Gaulle's fury, offers unclear excuses about safety worries, and then continues with the operation precisely as intended. De Gaulle's disagreements are observed and disregarded. The template remains: Britain will back Free France, will accept de Gaulle as its chief, will assist him returning to France as a lawful power. But Britain will not permit de Gaulle to truly affect British strategic choices. And still, when Allied troops arrive in Normandy, when France starts its freedom, Churchill confirms that French troops are involved, that de Gaulle is placed to go back to Paris, that the Free French have the prominence and acknowledgement they require. He grumbles about de Gaulle each part of the way, but he provides the backing he pledged 4 years prior when he approved that BBC broadcast. The ultimate evaluation of what Churchill said regarding de Gaulle's declaration comes not in speech, but in this lasting, irritating, finally triumphant collaboration. Churchill never states de Gaulle was correct, that France had only lost a battle. He never openly commends the 18th of June address. He never admits that de Gaulle's difficult arrogance was precisely what France required in its bleakest instant. But he behaves on that awareness. For 4 years, he backs a man he finds almost insufferable because that man personifies something Churchill grasps is vital. De Gaulle's rejection to accept defeat, his assertion that France's real nature was shaped by opposition rather than submission, his total conviction that he individually embodied French sovereignty, these traits made him difficult to partner with and difficult to forsake. When de Gaulle strolls down the Champs-Élysées in August 1944, as Paris rejoices in its freedom, Churchill observes from London and feels, by all reports, a blend of comfort and justification. The difficult French general has shown himself handy at last. The load has been worth carrying. The seed placed in June 1940 has developed into something significant. Churchill's personal remark to an assistant that day is typically witty. Well, he states, at least we will not have to interact with him quite so much now. But he is grinning as he states it, and when de Gaulle dispatches a communication thanking Britain for its backing, Churchill replies with true friendliness, recognizing the collaboration even as he anticipates its ending. The profoundest irony is that Churchill and de Gaulle, despite their endless conflict, had a basic likeness. Both were difficult men, certain of their own rightness, unwilling to yield on issues of principle, prepared to be problematic if being problematic helped their nation's goals. Churchill could not tolerate de Gaulle partly because de Gaulle mirrored Churchill's own most problematic traits. In his war histories penned years after, Churchill allots significant room to de Gaulle and the Free French. The tone is intricate, blending irritation with regard, grievance with admission. He portrays de Gaulle as problematic but essential, difficult but precious, a load that had to be carried for the good of the alliance and for France itself. He never straight out repeats the France has lost a battle address, but he frames it detailing how de Gaulle reached London with only belief, how that belief gradually gained strength, how the voice talking from BBC studios in June 1940 became the voice that guided France back to sovereignty. What Churchill finally said regarding de Gaulle's well-known declaration was this: he approved it, backed it, shielded the man who made it, grumbled about him endlessly, and never once implied that supporting de Gaulle had been an error. The address pledged that France would keep on battling. Churchill ensured that pledge could be honored, even when honoring it signified interacting with the most problematic partner he ever had. In 1945, after Germany's capitulation, Churchill and de Gaulle gather in Paris. The war in Europe is finished. France has been freed. De Gaulle is currently the leader of the French Provisional Government, no longer a general with no power talking from exile. Churchill is yet Prime Minister, though his political standing at home is progressively unsure. They sit together, these two difficult men who have passed 5 years irritating each other, and Churchill lifts a glass. To France he states plainly. De Gaulle replies to the alliance. It is as near as either of them will get to recognizing the odd, problematic, finally triumphant collaboration that started when Churchill approved a BBC broadcast by a French general nearly no one had known of. What Churchill said when de Gaulle informed the world that France has lost a battle, but not the war, was not one remark but a 5-year reply provided through deeds more than speech. He said, "I will back you even though you are difficult. I will shield your standing even though you make my life problematic. I will confirm you have the assets and acknowledgement to make your vision genuine, even though I find you almost insufferable. And when France is freed, when your difficult declaration shows itself to have been accurate, I will admit that the load was worth carrying. Churchill never gave de Gaulle the contentment of stating, "You were correct." But he gave him something more precious, the backing that made being correct possible. Example _A. The address in June 1940 was bold, asserting power that did not exist. Churchill's reply was to assist in forging the reality that made the claim genuine. He transformed de Gaulle's difficult declaration into established fact, grumbling each part of the way. Years after, long after both men had departed power, Churchill was queried about de Gaulle. The asker anticipated the typical grievances, the known irritations. Instead, Churchill stopped, reflected, and stated something unforeseen. He was unbearable, Churchill admitted. But France required someone unbearable, someone who would not yield, would not bargain, would not concede that France's defeat was total. I could not have achieved what he did. I was battling for Britain's existence. He was battling for France's spirit. Those are different struggles needing different men. It is the nearest Churchill ever got to commending de Gaulle straight out, and it seizes the vital truth of their connection. What Churchill said regarding de Gaulle's declaration that France had lost a battle but not the war was this: he trusted it enough to wager British assets on it, found it unbearable enough to grumble about endlessly, and perceived it as genuine enough to protect it, even when protecting it made his life vastly more problematic. The BBC broadcast on the 18th of June 1940 endured 5 minutes. The collaboration it began endured 5 years, and what Churchill said regarding it in the finish was recorded not in remarks, but in the lasting, irritating, finally triumphant attempt to confirm that de Gaulle's difficult declaration became historical reality.